There's a specific kind of arrogance in a man who thinks he can buy a life. Arthur, the Duke of Westford, didn't care that his bride was supposedly a monster. He needed her dowry to save his rotting estate, and he figured he could lock her in a country house and forget she existed. But when the wedding night came, and the heavy velvet veil finally dropped to the floor, the woman standing before him wasn't a monster at all. She was his reckoning, and in a single second, his entire empire turned to ash. The ink on the marriage contract was still wet, gleaming under the weak afternoon light that filtered through the filthy windows of Arthur's study. Arthur Pendleton, the 9th Duke of Westford, stared at his signature. It looked steady. A lie, of course. His stomach was a tight knot of sour wine and sheer exhaustion. He set the quill down. The scratch of metal on parchment had sounded like a blade across bone. Across the mahogany desk, Lord Reginald Harlow exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for a decade. Harlow was a man built like a root vegetable. Stout, sweating, perpetually unwashed despite the fortune he carried. He reached for his handkerchief, dabbing the glistening rim of his collar. "You won't regret this, Your Grace," Harlow stammered. His eyes darted around the cavernous library, taking in the empty spaces on the walls where the Westford ancestral portraits used to hang before the bailiffs took them. "My Beatrice. She is a quiet girl. She won't be a bother." "I expect nothing from her, Harlow," Arthur said. His voice was entirely devoid of inflection. "Only the transfer of the £50,000 to the Bank of England by Tuesday, and the deeds to the Bristol shipyards." Harlow nodded eagerly. Yes, of course. The money is secured." He paused, his fleshy fingers twisting the linen handkerchief into a knot. "And the terms regarding her privacy?" Arthur leaned back in his chair. The leather groaned. It was cracked, splitting at the seams, much like the dukedom itself. His father had left him nothing but a title and a mountain of gambling debts that threatened to throw Arthur into a debtor's prison. Society called Arthur aloof. In reality, he was drowning. "She will have the east wing of the manor," Arthur recited mechanically, repeating the terms they had negotiated for the past agonizing month. "She may keep her own staff. I will not compel her to attend social functions. I will not require her to show her face in London." "And the veil?" Harlow pressed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "She may wear it whenever she pleases," Arthur said, fighting the urge to roll his eyes. The rumours about Beatrice Harlow had circulated through the drawing rooms of London for 5 years. They said she had been caught in a nursery fire as an infant. They said half her face was melted wax. They said she was a grotesque, a pity kept locked in Harlow's country estate, hidden from a polite society that would faint at the sight of her. Other whispers claimed it was a wasting disease, or that she was born with the features of a beast. Arthur didn't give a damn. If she had a pig's snout, or no nose at all, it made no difference. He wasn't marrying a woman. He was marrying a ledger. The £50,000 would clear the creditors waiting like vultures outside his gates. The shipyards would provide a steady income to repair the crumbling roof over his head. It was a transaction. Flesh for coin. It was the way of the world, stripped of all the romantic poetry that Tunn liked to pretend existed. "She is sensitive about her appearance, Your Grace," Harlow said, almost pleadingly. "She is my Duchess now, Harlow. She will be treated with the respect the title commands," Arthur replied. He stood up. He was a tall man, sharply angled, with eyes the colour of a bruised winter sky. He carried the natural, oppressive authority of his bloodline, even if his pockets were empty. "Send her to St. Jude's Chapel on Thursday. Have the money transferred." Harlow scurried out of the room like a frightened rat. When the heavy oak door clicked shut, Arthur finally let his shoulders drop. He walked over to the side table, picked up a crystal decanter and poured 2 fingers of cheap brandy. He drank it neat, letting the burn distract him from the cold reality of his life. He was 28 years old, and he had just sold himself to a monster to clean up his father's mess. He stared at his reflection in the tarnished mirror above the fireplace. He looked hollowed out. There was no joy in the survival he had just secured. Just a long, bleak tunnel of years ahead, tethered to a phantom in the East Wing. He poured another drink. It didn't help. Thursday morning brought a relentless, driving rain that turned the London streets into rivers of black mud. St. Jude's was a small, damp chapel on the edge of the city, chosen specifically for its obscurity. Arthur stood at the altar, the collar of his formal coat feeling like a hangman's noose. The air inside the stone walls smelled of wet wool, old incense, and decay. There were no flowers. There were no guests. Just Arthur, his grim-faced solicitor, Harlow, and the priest, who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the chapel opened with a drawn-out creak. The wind howled through the gap, flickering the meagre candlelight. Arthur turned. Beatrice Harlow stood in the doorway. She was a silhouette wrapped in black and charcoal grey. It wasn't a traditional bridal gown. It looked more like mourning attire. The dress was thick, heavy silk that dragged across the damp flagstones. But it was the veil that commanded the room. It was dense, opaque lace, falling from the crown of her head all the way down to her waist. It completely swallowed her features. She looked like an apparition, a ghost summoned from a crypt rather than a bride. Harlow rushed to her side, offering his arm. She didn't take it. She walked down the aisle alone. Her steps were measured, silent. She didn't hesitate. As she drew closer, Arthur searched the black lace for any hint of a face underneath. Nothing. Just an impenetrable void. She stepped up to the altar beside him. She smelled faintly of crushed lavender and something sharp, like ozone before a lightning strike. She was taller than he expected, the crown of her head reaching his chin. The priest cleared his throat and began the liturgy. His voice echoed off the damp stone, rushing through the ancient words of binding and duty. Arthur stared straight ahead at the crucifix on the wall. He felt entirely detached from his own body. He was watching a tragedy play out from the rafters. "Do you, Arthur Pendleton, take this woman?" "I do," Arthur said. His voice was flat. "Do you, Beatrice Harlow, take this man?" There was a pause. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. Arthur felt a sudden, irrational spike of panic. What if she said no? What if the money vanished? He turned his head slightly, looking at the black veil. "I do," she said. Her voice hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't the weak, trembling whisper of a broken, frightened girl. It was low, smooth, and laced with absolute certainty. It sounded like velvet wrapped around a blade. Arthur blinked, thrown off balance. Before he could process it, the priest was asking for the ring. Arthur reached out. From beneath the folds of her grey silk sleeve, she extended her hand. She wore gloves, thick, black kid leather. Of course, no skin allowed to show. He slid the heavy gold band over the leather on her ring finger. It felt absurd. A pantomime of a marriage. "I pronounce you man and wife." There was no kiss. Harlow had strictly forbidden it in the contract, a clause Arthur had happily agreed to. They walked back down the aisle in silence. The carriage was waiting outside in the pouring rain. Arthur handed her up into the dark interior, following her in and shutting the door against the storm. The carriage lurched forward, beginning the long journey back to the Westford estate in the country. They sat opposite each other. The rhythm of the wheels over the cobblestones was the only sound. The interior of the carriage was dim, the rain lashing against the glass. Arthur watched her. She sat perfectly still, her gloved hands folded in her lap. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't weeping. She was perfectly, unnervingly still. "You don't need to be afraid," Arthur said finally, breaking the silence. He thought he was being kind. He thought he was playing the benevolent lord. "I am a man of my word. Your father and I agreed on the terms. You will have your sanctuary." The veiled head tilted slightly. "My sanctuary." There was that voice again. Low. Mocking? No, not mocking. Dismissive. "Yes," Arthur said, frowning. "You will not be forced into my company. I have my life. You will have yours. We need only endure each other occasionally to keep up appearances for the staff." "How wonderfully progressive of you, Your Grace," she murmured. Arthur's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being spoken to with such dry sarcasm, let alone by a woman who had been locked in a basement for 5 years. "I am trying to make this palatable for both of us, madam. I am well aware of your condition. You need not hide in fear in my house." "My condition?" she repeated. She turned her head toward the window, watching the blur of the rain. "Tell me, Arthur, when you signed the contract, did you imagine me a burn victim or a leper?" Arthur froze. "I imagined you as £50,000 and a shipyard." A soft, dark chuckle came from behind the lace. "Honesty. How refreshing. Let us hope you maintain that honesty when the carriage stops." She didn't speak another word for the rest of the 3-hour journey. Arthur sat in the growing dark, a deep, primal unease taking root in his chest. The transaction was complete, but for the first time, he wondered who, exactly, had bought whom. The Westford estate loomed in the darkness, a massive, sprawling beast of stone and ivy. Half the windows were dark, a testament to the closed-off wings and the lack of servants. Arthur escorted Beatrice up the grand staircase. Their footsteps echoed loudly in the cavernous, under-furnished hall. He led her to the master suite. The fire had been lit by the housekeeper, casting long, flickering shadows against the faded damask wallpaper. Arthur closed the door behind them. The click of the lock sounded permanent. Final. "Your trunks arrived yesterday," Arthur said, gesturing to the corner of the room. "The adjoining door leads to your private chambers. You may retire whenever you wish." Beatrice stood in the center of the room. The black veil still obscured her face. She slowly pulled off her leather gloves, finger by finger. She dropped them onto a side table. Her hands were pale, long-fingered, unblemished. There were no scars. Arthur walked over to the liquor cabinet. He needed a drink desperately. He poured 2 glasses of scotch. He didn't ask if she wanted one. He simply set it on the table near her. "I will be direct," Arthur said, keeping his back to her as he took a sip of his own drink. "The contract stipulates an heir. I do not wish to rush you. I do not wish to force you. But eventually, the debt of blood must be paid. Take whatever time you need to become comfortable. Look at me." The command was so sharp, so authoritative, that Arthur turned around before his brain could process the demand. Beatrice was reaching up. Her pale hands found the pins holding the heavy lace to her hair. One by one, she pulled them free. They clattered softly onto the wooden floorboards. Arthur's breath hitched. He braced himself. He prepared to see the ruin, the melted flesh, the horror that had kept her exiled from the world. He hardened his eyes, determined not to show a flicker of pity or revulsion. He owed her that much dignity. She grabbed the hem of the veil and pulled it over her head, letting the heavy fabric fall to the floor in a puddle of black. Arthur dropped his glass. It hit the floorboards, the scotch splashing violently, the crystal rolling away. He didn't notice. He couldn't breathe. There were no scars. There was no disfigurement. There was no disease. Beatrice Harlow was, without a single doubt, the most devastatingly beautiful woman Arthur had ever seen. She had skin like polished alabaster, high aristocratic cheekbones, and lips painted a dark, bruised red. Her hair was a cascade of midnight silk tumbling over her shoulders. but it was her eyes that pinned him to the spot. They were a piercing, icy green, and they were staring at him with a hatred so pure, so concentrated, it felt like standing in a blizzard. "You," Arthur choked out, stepping back. His mind was misfiring, desperately trying to reconcile the monster of the rumors with the goddess in his bedroom. "Why?" "The rumors. Your face. A fabrication," Beatrice said. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It rang out in the quiet room, commanding and lethal. A very expensive, very careful fabrication, maintained by my father. At my instruction, Arthur stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. "At your instruction?" "Why?" Beatrice walked toward him. She moved with the predatory grace of a panther. She didn't look like a timid victim. She looked like a conqueror assessing a newly captured territory. She stopped in front of the table, picked up the glass of scotch he had poured for her, and took a slow sip. "You think you married a frightened, scarred little girl for her father's money," she said, her green eyes locked on his. "You think you sold yourself to save this rotting pile of stone. Arthur couldn't find his footing. "I signed a contract with Reginald Harlow. My father is an idiot," Beatrice said coldly. "He does what I tell him to do. He signs what I tell him to sign. Because I hold the purse strings. I made the fortune, Arthur. Not him. I built the shipping lines. I invested the capital. I played the markets in a man's name from behind a black veil. Because this wretched society would never let a woman hold the knife." Arthur's mind spun. "Then why this? Why marry me? Why the charade?" Beatrice set the glass down. She reached into the pocket of her heavy grey skirts and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. She tossed it onto the table between them. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. "Open it," she commanded. Arthur slowly reached out. His hands were shaking. He flipped the cover open. The pages were filled with neat, aggressive handwriting, columns of numbers, dates, names. He recognized the names. They were his creditors, the men who held his gambling markers, the banks that held the mortgages on his land. He flipped the page. A document of transfer. Signed over. All of it. "You didn't marry a dowry, Arthur," Beatrice said softly, stepping closer until he could feel the cold radiating off her. "You married your owner." Arthur stared at the ledger. Every debt his father had accrued. Every loan Arthur had desperately taken out to keep the roof from caving in. The Bristol shipyards weren't a gift. They were the collateral she had used to buy up his entire existence. "I bought your debts. I bought your land. I bought your title," Beatrice whispered, leaning in so close he could smell the lavender on her skin. "I own this house. I own the servants. I own the clothes on your back." Arthur looked up at her, nausea rising in his throat. "Why?" Beatrice's beautiful, flawless face contorted into something vicious. The mask cracked, revealing a deep, rotting wound beneath the ice. 10 years ago," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, ragged hiss. "Your father ruined a merchant named Thomas Wright, stripped him of his patents, stole his ships, and drove him into a debtor's prison where he died of typhus." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. Thomas Wright. He remembered the name. A scandal from his adolescence. His father had crushed a rival ruthlessly. "Reginald Harlow is my stepfather," Beatrice said. "My real name is Beatrice Wright. And I have spent the last 10 years turning myself into a monster in the dark, gathering every piece of gold I could find, just so I could stand in this room and look you in the eye when I took everything from you." Arthur couldn't speak. The floor seemed to have vanished beneath his feet. The cynical, detached world he thought he understood had just been violently shattered. "You thought you could buy a life by locking an ugly girl in the East Wing," Beatrice said, stepping back. She looked at him with absolute disgust. "But you're the one in the cage now, Your Grace. and I am going to make you bleed for every single thing your family took from mine." She turned and walked toward the adjoining door. "Enjoy your wedding night," she called out over her shoulder, stepping into her private chambers. The door slammed shut, the lock engaged with a loud, fatal click. Arthur Pendleton stood alone in the flickering firelight, staring at the ledger that contained his utter ruin, realizing that his life had not just fallen apart. It had been systematically dismantled by a ghost. Morning arrived, not with the gentle creep of sunlight, but with the brutal clatter of a coal scuttle. Arthur lay on top of the velvet bedspread, still wearing his formal trousers and a rumpled linen shirt. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night staring at the ceiling, waiting to wake up from a fevered dream. His head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, the cheap scotch acting as a poor anesthetic for the absolute demolition of his reality. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed. The floorboards were freezing. He looked at the adjoining door. It remained firmly shut. He needed to see his solicitor. He needed to find a loophole. There was no precedent for this. A woman, a commoner, secretly buying up a dukedom and holding her husband hostage through financial ruin. It was madness. It was legally dubious. It had to be. Arthur washed his face with cold water from the basin, shoved his arms into a dressing gown, and marched down the grand staircase. The house, usually a tomb of dust and silence, was unnervingly loud. The sound of sweeping, the smell of fresh beeswax. He rounded the corner toward his study, the last bastion of his authority. The door was ajar. He pushed it open. The words died in his throat. Beatrice was sitting at his mahogany desk. She wore a tailored dress of deep forest green, entirely unadorned, severely practical. Her dark hair was pinned up in a ruthless coil. She had a pen in her hand, the tip scratching sharply across a thick stack of invoices. Standing across from her, nervously twisting his cap, was Mr. Higgins, the estate manager who had sneered at Arthur's inability to pay him just 3 days prior. "The South Fields require better drainage before we attempt to plant winter wheat," Beatrice was saying, her tone brisk and entirely devoid of the mocking edge she had used the night before. "Hire 12 local men. Pay them $1 a day, not the half-shilling you've been exploiting them for." "And Higgins?" Yes, Your Grace," Higgins stammered, his eyes wide. "If I find out you've been skimming the timber sales again, as your ledger from 1823 suggests, I will have you transported to New South Wales. Am I clear?" Higgins turned a spectacular shade of grey. "Perfectly clear, Your Grace." Dismissed. Higgins practically fell over himself, rushing out the door, squeezing past Arthur without offering his usual perfunctory bow. Arthur stepped fully into the room. "What do you think you are doing?" Beatrice didn't look up. She dipped her pen in the inkwell. "Managing my property. Your father ran this estate like a drunkard at a roulette wheel. It will take me 3 years just to stabilize the crop rotation." "You have no right," Arthur snapped, stepping up to the desk. "You may hold the debts, Beatrice, but I am the Duke of Westford. This is my land. This is my house." She finally looked at him. Her green eyes were flat, assessing him the way a butcher assesses a tough cut of meat. "You are a figurehead," she stated simply, "a signature on a piece of paper. The only reason I haven't foreclosed on this rotting manor and thrown you into the Fleet prison is because society requires a duke to sit at the head of the table to legitimize the wealth. You are an ornament, Arthur. Nothing more." The casual dismissal stung worse than a slap. Arthur braced his hands on the desk, leaning down until he was inches from her face. "I will take you to Chancery. I will have the marriage annulled. I will expose your father's fraud." "Go ahead," Beatrice interrupted, her voice dangerously quiet. "Annul the marriage. Walk out that door. The moment you do, I call in the notes. You will be arrested for debt before you reach London. The Pendleton name will be dragged through the mud, your ancestral home sold for parts, and you will rot in a cell exactly like my father did." She held his gaze, unblinking. The air between them felt thick, combustible. You think you have leverage, she whispered. You have nothing. I built my fortune in the shadows because men like you think women are weak, vain, and stupid. I weaponized your arrogance against you. Now sit down and be quiet, or pack your bags and go to prison. The choice is entirely yours. Arthur stared at her. He saw the cold, hard logic in her eyes. She wasn't bluffing. She had meticulously planned this execution for a decade. He was completely trapped. Slowly, agonizingly, Arthur pushed himself off the desk. He felt stripped naked, robbed of the invisible armor his title had provided his entire life. I need tea, he muttered, his voice barely recognizable. Tell the kitchen staff, Beatrice said, returning her attention to the ledger. And Arthur? Please put on proper clothes. The workmen are arriving at noon to fix the roof, and I will not have my husband looking like a vagrant. Arthur walked out of the study. The heavy oak door didn't click shut behind him, but it felt like a vault had just been sealed. 4 weeks passed. The Westford estate, previously a decaying corpse, was suddenly jolted back to life by a massive infusion of Beatrice's capital. The leaky roof in the west wing was stripped and replaced. The overgrown gardens were hacked back into manicured submission. The stables, empty for 2 years, were suddenly filled with purebred Hanoverians. Delivery wagons arrived daily from London, offloading new silver, fresh linens, and modern agricultural equipment, and Arthur wandered through the center of it all like a ghost. He had become a spectator in his own life. The servants, recognizing immediately where the power and the coin originated, bypassed him entirely. If Arthur asked for a horse to be saddled, the groom would look to Beatrice for a nod of approval. If Arthur suggested a change to the dinner menu, the cook would politely explain that Her Grace had already approved the week's provisions. It was a systematic, flawless castration of his pride. And yet, despite his simmering rage, Arthur found himself watching her. He watched her command rooms of hardened foremen, speaking with an authority that commanded instant respect. He watched her pore over architectural blueprints by candlelight, her glasses slipping down the bridge of her nose, rubbing her eyes in exhaustion when she thought no one was looking. She was ruthless, yes, but she was brilliant. She wasn't just hoarding wealth. She was building an empire. She was fixing the lives of the tenant farmers his father had starved. She was repairing the local village school. She was everything a duke was supposed to be, operating seamlessly inside the shell of his failure. The tension between them was a living, breathing thing. They took their meals together in the cavernous dining hall at opposite ends of a 20-foot mahogany table. The silence was usually deafening, punctuated only by the clink of silverware against porcelain. On a rainy Tuesday evening, the silence broke. Arthur pushed his plate away. The roasted pheasant was excellent. He hated that it was excellent. I spoke with Thomas, the tenant at Miller's Hollow, Arthur said, his voice echoing in the large room. Beatrice didn't look up from her wine glass. I told you not to interfere with the leases. His son is sick. He cannot meet the harvest quota this month, Arthur pressed, leaning forward. My father would have evicted him. I told him we would grant him an extension until spring. Beatrice finally looked down the length of the table. Her expression was unreadable. You offered him an extension on my land. It was the right thing to do, Arthur said, his jaw tightening. You have the capital. A few months' delay on 100 pounds of grain means nothing to your ledgers. It means a break in precedent, Beatrice replied coldly. If I grant leniency to one, the others will expect it. I am running a business, Arthur, not a charity. You are running a fiefdom, Arthur snapped, his temper finally fraying. He stood up, throwing his napkin onto the table. You sit there, judging my family's cruelty, claiming you are better than us. But you are doing the exact same thing. You are wielding power just to prove you have it. You are becoming the monster you swore to destroy. Beatrice's hands froze on the stem of her glass. Her knuckles went white. She stood up slowly, The air in the room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Do not ever compare me to your father," she said. Her voice wasn't a shout. It was a lethal, vibrating hiss. "Why not?" Arthur challenged, stepping away from his chair, closing the distance between them. "He destroyed your father for profit. You are destroying me for vengeance." "What is the difference, Beatrice? Tell me." "The difference," she breathed, her chest heaving, "is that my father was an honest man who built his life with his own 2 hands. Your father was a parasite who stole because he was too lazy to work. He left us with nothing. My mother died of consumption in a freezing rooming house because we couldn't afford coal. I survived on scraps from the butcher's floor." Her mask was slipping. The cold, calculating mastermind was suddenly gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding wound of a woman. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her pristine composure shattering under the weight of a decade of suppressed agony. Arthur stopped, the anger drained out of him, replaced by a sudden, hollow ache in his chest. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the frightened, starving girl she had been, buried beneath the silk and the ice. "I didn't know," Arthur said quietly. "Of course you didn't know," Beatrice sneered, wiping a stray tear from her cheek with a vicious, angry swipe of her hand. "The aristocracy doesn't look down to see who they are stepping on. You only look down to check if your boots are clean." She turned and marched towards the heavy doors of the dining room. "Beatrice," Arthur called out. She didn't stop. "Beatrice, wait!" He caught her arm just as she reached for the handle. She flinched violently, pulling her arm back as if his touch burned. "Do not touch me." Arthur held his hands up, taking a step back. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, foreign and clumsy. Arthur had never apologized for his family in his life. He had spent years defending the indefensible, protecting the legacy of a man he secretly despised, just to maintain his own illusion of superiority. Beatrice stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She searched his face, looking for the mockery, the arrogance. She found nothing but quiet, genuine exhaustion. "Your apologies are worthless, Arthur," she whispered. Her voice was cracked, weary. "They cannot buy back the dead." She opened the door and walked out, leaving Arthur standing alone in the grand dining room, suddenly acutely aware of how heavy the silence had become. The storm rolled in off the coast 3 days later, bringing with it a violent, lashing rain that rattled the stained glass windows of the library. Thunder shook the floorboards. Arthur sat in a leather armchair near the dying fire, a book resting unread on his lap. It was past midnight. The house was entirely still, the servants long since retired to their quarters. Across the room, Beatrice was hunched over the main desk. A single candelabra illuminated her face, casting deep, tired shadows beneath her eyes. She had been there for 6 hours, reviewing the shipping manifests from the Bristol yards. The rhythmic scratch of her pen had been the only sound competing with the storm. Arthur watched her. The dynamic between them had shifted since the argument in the dining room. It wasn't peace. It was a ceasefire. A fragile, hyper-aware truce built on the sudden realization that they were both prisoners of the Westford legacy. Suddenly the pen snapped. The sound was sharp like a pistol crack. Beatrice swore softly, dropping the broken pieces of wood onto the blotter. She pushed herself back from the desk, pressing the heels of her hands hard against her eyes. She let out a long, ragged exhale that sounded incredibly small in the cavernous room. Arthur closed his book. He stood up, walked over to the liquor cabinet, and poured 2 glasses of scotch. He carried them over to the desk, placing one gently near her elbow. It was an exact mirror of their wedding night, but stripped of the venom. Beatrice lowered her hands. She looked at the amber liquid, then up at him. She looked exhausted. The severe bun at the nape of her neck was fraying, loose strands of dark hair framing her pale face. "I am not trying to poison you," Arthur said softly, sitting on the edge of the large desk, keeping a respectful distance. Beatrice picked up the glass. She didn't say thank you, but she took a slow sip, letting the alcohol burn down her throat. "The Bristol yards are bleeding money," she admitted. The confession seemed forced out of her by sheer fatigue. "The foreman is incompetent, and the lumber tariffs have doubled." It was the first time she had shared a problem with him. The first time she hadn't acted invincible. "My father bought Bristol because he wanted to own a fleet," Arthur said, looking at the fire. "He didn't know the first thing about maritime trade. He just liked the idea of his flag on a mast." "It was vanity," Beatrice murmured. "Everything he did was vanity," Arthur agreed. He turned to look at her. "He ruined your father because Wright Shipping was outperforming him. He couldn't stand being beaten by a man who didn't have a title." Beatrice tightened her grip on the glass. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to know that I never defended him," Arthur said quietly. "I knew what he was. I hated him for it. I hated him for leaving me this rotting carcass of an estate, and I hated myself for not knowing how to fix it." Beatrice stared at him. The flickering candlelight caught the icy green of her eyes, but the ice was melting. "You act as though you don't care about anything. A cynical, detached lord playing the victim." "It was survival," Arthur replied, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "If I cared, the shame would have killed me. You built a wall of gold and ledgers to protect yourself, Beatrice. I built a wall of apathy. We are both just hiding." The silence that followed was charged. It wasn't the bitter, cold silence of hatred. It was heavy, pulling at them like a magnetic current. The storm raged outside, throwing shadows across the walls. Beatrice set her glass down. She looked at Arthur, sitting on the edge of her desk, the Grand Duke reduced to a man sitting in the dark, laying his failures bare. "You offered Miller's Hollow the extension," she said suddenly. Arthur blinked. "What?" "I checked the lease ledgers today," Beatrice said, her voice dropping lower. "You went behind my back. You authorized Higgins to defer the rent until spring. You guaranteed the debt yourself." Arthur tensed. He had expected her to find out eventually. "I did. Take it out of my allowance, or put it on my tab. I don't care. The boy has typhus. Beatrice. He needed a doctor, not an eviction notice. He braced himself for the fury. He waited for her to scream, to remind him of his place, to threaten him with debtor's prison again. Instead, Beatrice stood up. She stepped around the desk. She was so close now that Arthur could smell the sharp, clean scent of lavender mixed with rain. He looked up at her, his pulse suddenly hammering against his throat. "You guaranteed a debt you cannot pay," she said, her voice barely a breath. "You broke my explicit orders." "I did," Arthur said, refusing to break eye contact. "Punish me." Beatrice's eyes searched his face. The hatred that had fueled her for a decade was warring with something else entirely. Something dark, confusing, and desperately physical. She raised her hand. Arthur didn't flinch. He let her cold, pale fingers trace the line of his jaw. The touch sent a violent shockwave straight down his spine. "You're a fool, Arthur Pendleton," she whispered, her thumb brushing against his lower lip. "I know," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her mouth. The air in the room shattered. Beatrice leaned in, closing the distance between them. It wasn't a soft, romantic kiss. It was a collision, a violent, desperate clash of teeth and breath, fueled by weeks of suffocating tension and years of mutual destruction. Arthur gripped her waist, pulling her hard against his chest, his hands tangling in the heavy fabric of her practical dress. She tasted like scotch and smoke, her hands grabbing the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the man she had sworn to destroy. They broke apart, both breathing heavily, staring at each other in the dim light of the dying fire. The lines had been irrevocably blurred. The war wasn't over, but the battlefield had just completely changed. The kiss ended as violently as it had begun. Beatrice shoved him backward. Her breathing was ragged, her chest rising and falling in sharp, desperate increments. She wiped the back of her hand across her bruised mouth, staring at Arthur as if he had just driven a knife between her ribs. The library was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rain hammering against the glass. "Get out," she whispered. Arthur caught his balance against the heavy oak desk. His blood was roaring in his ears. He looked at her, at the flushed skin of her throat, the wild disarray of her hair. He wanted to pull her back. He wanted to tear down the rest of the walls she had spent a decade building. But he saw the sheer, unadulterated panic in her green eyes. She was a woman who relied on absolute control, and she had just completely lost it. He didn't say a word. He nodded slowly, turned, and walked out of the library, leaving the heavy door slightly ajar. The next 3 days were a masterclass in evasion. Beatrice vanished into the mechanics of the estate. She took her meals in her private chambers. She left the house before dawn to inspect the southern tenant farms and didn't return until the lamps were lit. When they did cross paths in the grand hallway or the foyer, she looked through him. The ice had returned, but it was brittle now. A thin sheet over rushing water. Arthur let her run. He spent his days in the stables, working the new Hanoverians until his muscles burned and his mind went entirely blank. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the crushing weight of apathy. He felt a terrifying, electric anticipation. The game had changed. He just didn't know the new rules yet. On the morning of the 4th day, the fragile ceasefire shattered. Arthur was in the drawing room, attempting to read a newspaper that was 3 days old, when the heavy knocker on the front door echoed through the manor. It was an aggressive, demanding sound. A moment later, the butler, a newly hired man named Carson, appeared in the doorway. "Your Grace, Lord Carmichael is here." Arthur's stomach dropped. Richard Carmichael was an earl, a contemporary of Arthur's late father, and a man who possessed the moral compass of a starving hyena. He was also the largest single creditor of the Westford estate before Beatrice had bought up the debts. "Show him in," Arthur said, tossing the newspaper onto a side table. He stood up, adjusting his cuffs, pulling the mask of the detached, arrogant Duke firmly into place. Carmichael strode into the room, bringing the smell of stale cigar smoke and wet wool with him. He was a heavily built man with a ruddy complexion and eyes that constantly darted around the room, assessing the value of everything he saw. He didn't bow. "Arthur, my boy," Carmichael boomed, clapping his leather gloves against his thigh. "Look at this place. I heard rumors you'd found a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow, but I didn't believe it. New drapes? And I saw fresh gravel on the drive." "Lord Carmichael," Arthur said flatly. He didn't offer the man a seat. "To what do I owe the pleasure? It is a long journey from London for a social call." "Indeed it is." Carmichael stopped in the centre of the room, turning his predatory gaze on Arthur. The jovial uncle routine vanished instantly. "I'm not here for tea, Arthur. I'm here about a woman named B. Wright." Arthur's jaw tightened. He kept his expression perfectly blank. "I don't know who that is." "Don't play the fool with me," Carmichael sneered. "B. Wright Investments, the phantom proxy who bought up your father's debts from my bank for pennies on the pound right before your miraculous wedding. I spent the last 3 weeks digging into the registry in Bristol. You want to know what I found?" Arthur said nothing. "I found a solicitor who likes cheap gin," Carmichael continued, a nasty smile spreading across his face. "He processed the paperwork for the shipyards. He told me that B. Wright isn't a man. She's a woman. A spinster. Your new father-in-law's bastard stepdaughter, to be exact." The silence in the drawing room was absolute. Arthur could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "And?" Arthur asked quietly. "And?" Carmichael laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. "It's fraud, Arthur. A woman cannot legally conduct that level of commercial trade under a false male proxy without a sanctioned trust. It violates the Chancery codes. More importantly, she's your wife now. Under the law of coverture, everything she owns belongs to you. Every penny, every shipyard, every debt. I am aware of English law, Richard. Then you are aware of the position you are in. Carmichael took a step closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. You are holding the leash to a mad dog. I know you, Arthur. I know you hate the mud she dragged you through. Here is the offer. I take the Be Right contract to Chancery Court. I expose the fraud. The courts will nullify the initial purchase of the debt. It reverts back to me. I forgive half your father's debt as a finder's fee. You keep this manor and your shiny new title, and we lock the Harlow bitch in an asylum for hysteria and financial delusion. You get your life back. My life back, Arthur repeated slowly. You're a duke, Carmichael said, his eyes gleaming with greed. You shouldn't be taking orders from a merchant's bastard. We crush her, Arthur. We take the gold, and we erase her. The floorboards creaked. Arthur looked past Carmichael's shoulder. Beatrice was standing in the doorway of the drawing room. She wore a simple grey day dress, her hands clutching a leather-bound ledger against her chest. Her face was chalk white. She had heard everything. The absolute devastation in her eyes was a physical blow to Arthur's chest. For 10 years she had built an armor of wealth and secrecy, and in a single morning, an old, greedy man had stripped it all away, using the patriarchal laws she couldn't outrun. Carmichael turned, following Arthur's gaze. He let out a low, patronizing chuckle. Ah, the Duchess, Carmichael said, giving a mocking, abbreviated bow. Or should I say, be right. You had a good run, little girl, but the men are talking now. Go back to your sewing. Beatrice didn't move. She looked at Arthur. Her green eyes were wide, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. She was waiting for Arthur to agree. She was waiting for him to take his revenge, to side with his own kind, and to destroy her, just as his father had destroyed hers. It was the perfect out. It was everything Arthur had wanted a month ago. Arthur looked at Carmichael. Then he looked at his wife. The terrified, brilliant, furious woman who had fixed his leaking roof, saved a dying tenant farmer, and kissed him like the world was ending. Arthur closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, the detached, apathetic Duke was dead. Arthur moved so fast that Carmichael didn't have time to react. He crossed the distance between them, grabbed the lapels of Carmichael's heavy wool coat, and slammed the older man violently against the oak paneling of the wall. The impact rattled the framed landscape paintings on either side of them. Carmichael gasped, his face turning an immediate mottled purple. "Arthur! What the devil?" "Shut your mouth," Arthur hissed, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register that reverberated in the quiet room. "You breathe when I tell you to breathe." Beatrice gasped, taking a step forward, her grip tightening on her ledger. Arthur leaned his forearm against Carmichael's throat, applying just enough pressure to make the Earl gag. "You think you are clever, Richard," Arthur said smoothly, his tone entirely conversational despite the violence of his actions. "You think you dug up a secret. You dug up nothing. I orchestrated the entire thing." Carmichael's eyes bulged. "What? My father was a fool who bled this estate dry, and you were the parasite feeding on the corpse," Arthur lied. The words flowed out of him with absolute conviction. He was pulling the full oppressive weight of his aristocracy down on the man's head. "I knew you were planning to foreclose, so I found a merchant's daughter with a brilliant mind for numbers and a substantial hidden inheritance. I instructed her to create the Be Right proxy. I used her capital to buy my own debts, back from your bank at a fraction of the cost, right under your greedy, incompetent nose." That's a lie," Carmichael choked out, struggling against Arthur's grip. "She's a woman. The registry shows a legal proxy established by the Duke of Westford." Arthur lied again, betting entirely on the fact that Carmichael hadn't seen the actual founding documents, only the shipyard manifests. "It is entirely legal. And as for coverture, you are absolutely right. She is my wife. Her property is my property, which means I own the debt, I own the ships, and I own the very ground you are standing on." Arthur leaned in closer until his face was inches from Carmichael's sweating forehead. "If you ever step foot on my estate again," Arthur whispered, "if you ever speak my wife's name in London, if you ever breathe a word of your pathetic little conspiracy to Chancery Court, I will not just ruin you financially. I will use the Westford name to strip you of your peerage. I will buy the notes on your London townhouse, and I will personally throw your wife and daughters into the street. Do you understand me?" Carmichael was shaking. The blustering bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by genuine primal terror. Arthur wasn't the broken, defeated boy he had expected. He was a predator defending his territory. "Do you understand me?" Arthur repeated, pressing his forearm slightly harder against the windpipe. "Yes," Carmichael wheezed. "Yes, Your Grace." Arthur released him in one sharp motion, stepping back and straightening his own cuffs. He pointed to the doorway. "Get out of my house!" Carmichael didn't say another word. He stumbled away from the wall, shooting a terrified glance at Beatrice as he practically ran out of the drawing room. A moment later, the heavy front door slammed shut. The silence rushed back into the room, thick and heavy. Arthur stood in the center of the Persian rug, staring at the empty doorway. His hands were trembling slightly with residual adrenaline. He had just burned his only bridge back to polite society. He had just permanently tethered his fate, his title, and his name to Beatrice's empire. He had chosen his side. He slowly turned around to face her. Beatrice was standing exactly where she had been. The ledger had slipped from her hands and was lying on the floor. She was staring at Arthur, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The look in her eyes wasn't fear anymore. It was absolute, uncomprehending shock. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. It cracked on the last syllable. Arthur ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling exhausted. The aristocratic mask slipped away, leaving only the man beneath. "Because he was right," Arthur said quietly, closing the distance between them until he was standing a few feet away. "Under the law, everything you built belongs to me now. He offered me a way to take it, to take the money, throw you to the wolves, and get my pride back." Beatrice swallowed hard. And I realized I don't want my pride," Arthur said, looking directly into her green eyes. "I don't want the empty, miserable life my father left me. I don't want to be the monster in your story anymore, Beatrice." Beatrice stared at him. A single tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a path through the flawless, pale skin. She didn't bother to wipe it away. "You lied to an earl. You committed perjury. If he investigates the proxy founding dates, he could still take you to Chancery. You risked your title." "My title is a word on a piece of paper," Arthur replied. He took a step closer. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. "You are the one who rebuilt this estate. You are the one who saved the tenants. You are the Duke of Westford, Beatrice. I'm just the man lucky enough to stand next to you." A ragged, half-sob broke from her throat. The cold, calculating mastermind, the vengeful ghost of B. Wright, finally shattered into a million pieces. She closed the final distance between them, burying her face against his chest. Her hands gripped the fabric of his waistcoat, as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Arthur wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly against him. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of lavender and rain. She was shaking against him, the tension of 10 years of hatred and survival finally draining out of her body. "I bought you," she cried softly against his chest, the words muffled by his coat. "I bought you to destroy you. I wanted to break you." "I know," Arthur murmured, resting his chin on the top of her head. He closed his eyes, holding her tighter. "You did break me, Beatrice. And then you built something better." They stood there in the quiet drawing room, two people who had been hollowed out by the sins of their fathers, finally finding an anchor in the wreckage. The fire in the master suite was roaring, casting a warm, golden light across the velvet bedspread and the heavy mahogany furniture. Outside, the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a quiet, freezing night. Arthur sat on the edge of a wing-back chair near the hearth. He had shed his formal coat and cravat, his white linen shirt unbuttoned at the throat. He was staring into the flames, a glass of scotch resting forgotten in his hand. The heavy door adjoining the two bedrooms clicked open. Arthur turned his head. Beatrice stepped into the room. She was no longer wearing the severe, practical day dresses, nor the haunting black mourning clothes of their wedding day. She wore a simple, white silk dressing gown. Her dark hair was loose, tumbling over her shoulders in thick waves. She looked terrifyingly beautiful, stripped of all her armor. She walked over to the fireplace, her bare feet making no sound on the Persian rug. She didn't look at him immediately. She stared into the fire, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Carson sent Carmichael's solicitor a letter an hour ago," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Bearing your seal, banning him from the county. The Bristol registry has been sealed under a ducal decree." "Good," Arthur said. Beatrice finally turned to look at him. "You protected my assets, but under the law they are still yours. You could take them tomorrow. You could drain the accounts and leave me with nothing." Arthur set his glass down on the small table next to him. He stood up, towering over her, but he made sure his posture was open, entirely devoid of threat. "I don't want your money, Beatrice," he said. She reached into the pocket of her silk robe and pulled out a heavy iron key. She held it out to him. It rested on her pale palm, glinting in the firelight. "What is that?" Arthur asked, looking down at it. "The key to the lockbox in the Bank of England," Beatrice said softly. "It holds the master ledgers, the original B. Wright charters, the deeds to the shipyards, everything." Arthur looked from the key to her face. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because the war is over," Beatrice said. Her eyes were bright, wide, and entirely vulnerable. "I spent my entire adult life planning a siege. I built a fortress of gold because I thought it was the only way to keep the world from crushing me. I thought if I controlled the debt, I controlled the power. But I was wrong." She took a step closer, leaving only inches between them. She looked up at him, her heart laid completely bare. "Power isn't a ledger, Arthur. It's what you did this morning. You took the only thing you had left in this world, your name, your privilege, and you threw it in the mud to protect me. You didn't conquer me. You defended me." She pressed the cold iron key into his hand and closed his fingers over it. "I don't want to be B. Wright anymore," she whispered, a tear slipping free and catching the firelight. "I don't want to be the angry ghost in the East Wing. I just want to be your wife." Arthur stared at the woman before him. The transaction was truly dead. The vengeance had burned itself out, leaving only this raw, beautiful truth between them. He looked down at the key in his hand, the symbol of absolute control. He walked past her, toward the massive stone fireplace. He tossed the key directly into the center of the roaring flames. Beatrice gasped, spinning around. "Arthur, what are you doing? The bank!" "The bank can burn for all I care," Arthur said, turning back to face her. "I don't need a key to own you, Beatrice, and you don't need a ledger to own me." He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones, wiping away the tears. "My father is dead," Arthur said fiercely, His eyes locked onto hers. Your father is dead. Let them rot with their debts and their pride. This is our house now. This is our life. Beatrice let out a ragged breath, her hands coming up to grip his wrists. Arthur, I love you, he said. The words slipped out so easily, so naturally. It felt as though they had been sitting in his chest for months, waiting for the smoke to clear. I loved you when you were shouting at me in the dining room. I loved you when you broke your pen in the library. I loved you the moment you lifted that ridiculous veil and showed me exactly who you were. Beatrice stared at him, her lips parted, the final wall inside her collapsing completely. You are a fool, Your Grace. I am. Arthur smiled, a genuine, blinding smile that reached his eyes for the first time in a decade. But I'm your fool. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the violent, desperate clash of the library. It was deep, slow, and entirely surrendered. Beatrice let out a soft sound, wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him flush against her body. Arthur swept her into his arms, carrying her away from the fire and toward the heavy velvet drapes of the four-poster bed. He laid her down gently, following her down onto the mattress. There were no ghosts in the room anymore. There were no ledgers, no contracts, no fathers pulling strings from the grave. As the storm outside faded into a quiet, peaceful dawn, the Duke of Westford finally realized what it truly meant to be rich, and the monster of the East Wing finally realized what it meant to be loved. What a journey! From a bitter, transactional marriage meant to destroy a bloodline, to a genuine partnership built on shared survival and ultimate surrender. Arthur and Beatrice proved that sometimes the monsters we fear the most are the ones holding the key to our salvation. Did you expect Arthur to throw away his aristocratic pride to save her, or did you think he would take Carmichael's deal? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this enemies to lovers historical drama, make sure to like the video, share it with your fellow romance readers, and subscribe to the channel for more epic storytelling. See you in the next one.